Before the cowboys and the gunfighters, before the boomtowns and the railroads, there existed a vast and ancient continent whose interior remained almost entirely unknown to the young nation that had just claimed it on paper. In the early years of the 19th century, the United States doubled its size overnight with the stroke of a pen, acquiring millions of acres of land that no American official had ever seen, walked, or understood. Dozens of sovereign native nations had lived within those borders for thousands of years, shaping the rivers, the plains, and the mountain passes in ways no European map had ever captured. What followed was not simply a story of settlement and progress, but a slow and turbulent collision between an expanding civilization and the worlds that already existed in its path. It is a story of impossible courage and breathtaking cruelty, of myth makers and fortune seekers, of people who built legends and people whose worlds were quietly unmade. This is the complete and true history of the American frontier, and it is far stranger, far darker, and far more human than any legend has ever told. Welcome back to Whispered Empires, where the echoes of vanished worlds drift quietly through the darkness and find you wherever you rest tonight. If this kind of slow, thoughtful history brings you comfort, please feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely feels right to you. And if you have a moment, leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from and what the hour looks like where you are. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people across so many different time zones are settling into the same story at the same time. Tonight, we ask you this. When you imagine the American West, what image comes to your mind first? And where did that image come from? Hold that thought as you let your shoulders drop. Take one slow breath and allow yourself to drift gently into the full and true story of the entire history of the Wild West and the American frontier. Chapter 1: An Unknown Continent, the Louisiana Purchase, and the Lewis and Clark Expedition. In the year 1800, the interior of North America was a world vast and largely unmapped, a continent breathing quietly beneath an open sky that few eyes from the young United States had ever truly seen. From the eastern shores, the new republic reached only so far before the land dissolved into rumor and imagination. Beyond the settlements, beyond the trading posts and river landings, lay a patchwork of territories and peoples whose histories stretched back far longer than any nation newly born from revolution. At that time, the land west of the Mississippi was divided not by the maps of distant capitals, but by the presence and power of the nations who had always called it home. The Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota peoples ranged across the upper Mississippi and the Great Northern Plains. The Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara held the central river valleys, their earth lodge villages rising like quiet hills along the Missouri. To the south, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw governed the forested valleys of the southeast. Around the Great Lakes, the Ojibwe, Menominee, and Potawatomi moved with the seasons, their canoes threading the waters between Lake Superior and Lake Michigan. Further still, in the mountain reaches and the river basins of the interior Pacific Northwest, the Nez Perce and the Shoshone maintained their own sovereign worlds. These were not empty lands waiting for discovery. They were lands long known, long tended, and long governed by peoples with their own laws, their own trade, their own ceremonies, and their own understanding of the earth beneath their feet. The continent did not lack knowledge of itself. It was only unknown to those arriving from the east. Among the nations of the interior, life was shaped by sophisticated systems, far older than the republic forming along the Atlantic coast. The Lakota organized themselves into extended family circles, deliberating through councils where decisions carried the weight of communal agreement. The Mandan and Hidatsa governed their Earth Lodge settlements through councils of clan heads and war leaders, their villages serving as great centers of commerce and exchange along the Missouri River. These villages at the Knife River were among the most remarkable places on the continent. Traders traveled from remarkable distances to gather there: the Crow, the Cheyenne, the Assiniboine, and peoples from as far as the Pacific coast, bringing with them marine shells, obsidian, turquoise, horses, furs, and tobacco. In return, the Mandan and Hidatsa offered corn, beans, squash, dried bison meat, and pottery. It was a marketplace older than any trading post the Europeans had yet established. The Shoshone held their own rendezvous points in the mountain country, where the upper Missouri world met the peoples of the Pacific slopes. The Nez Perce brought salmon, camas root, and horses, trading for plains bison products and goods carried across the mountains. Spiritual life wove through all of it. The Lakota performed the sun dance, its ceremony binding community to the sacred rhythms of the world. The Mandan and Hidatsa conducted the Okipa ceremony, affirming their covenant with the forces that sustained them. Sacred bundles, medicine societies, and the ceremonial pipe guided decision-making and moral order throughout these nations. The interior of the continent was not a wilderness. It was a civilization of many voices, speaking in a language the arriving republic had not yet learned to hear. Across the ocean, in the courts of Europe, a very different kind of drama was unfolding. France, under Napoleon Bonaparte, had long harbored ambitions for a great empire in the Western Hemisphere. By the year 1800, a secret treaty had arranged the return of the vast Louisiana territory from Spain back to France, a transfer of enormous consequence if Napoleon could make use of it. His plan rested on a simple foundation. The sugar islands of the Caribbean, particularly the colony of Saint-Domingue on the island of Hispaniola, would generate the wealth to sustain a French empire rooted in the Americas. But that plan was already unraveling. On Saint-Domingue, the enslaved population had risen in a revolution of remarkable force and determination. Yellow fever ravaged the French military expeditions sent to suppress it. Resistance proved fierce, sustained, and ultimately victorious. Without Saint-Domingue, the Caribbean anchor of Napoleon's Western ambitions dissolved. At the same time, tensions in Europe were sharpening again. Britain's Royal Navy maintained a powerful presence on the Atlantic, and renewed war with Britain was drawing closer. Napoleon's expanding reach across Italy, the Low Countries, and Spain had strained diplomatic relations, and threatened to open new military fronts. France needed money. France needed to consolidate its position in Europe. A distant, largely ungoverned territory in the middle of the North American continent was becoming less an asset and more a liability. The Haitian Revolution, as it would come to be known, had broken the spine of Napoleon's American ambitions. What had been imagined as the foundation of a new world empire would instead be quietly offered to a young republic across the Atlantic for a price. The United States had not expected to purchase a continent. President Thomas Jefferson had sent his envoys to Paris with a far more modest ambition: secure the port of New Orleans and, if possible, the Floridas, so that American farmers and merchants could freely use the Mississippi River to move their goods to market. The authorized sum was $10 million. What they received instead astonished them. On April 30th, 1803, the agreement was signed. For $15 million, roughly 4 cents per acre, France transferred to the United States approximately 828,000 square miles of territory west of the Mississippi River, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border and from the Mississippi westward toward the Rocky Mountains. The precise northern and western boundaries remained matters to be settled later, clarified eventually through negotiations with Spain and Britain, and formalized in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. The price was almost inconceivably low for what it contained, but what exactly it contained was, at that moment, largely unknown. American officials understood that the land was vast. They understood that France had recently reacquired it from Spain, and that Spain still contested French title and retained some claim of reclamation. They knew that many native nations inhabited it. Beyond that, the interior of the new territory remained a place of sketchy knowledge and open imagination. Jefferson himself had authorized only the purchase of New Orleans. Now he held something incomparably larger, and it immediately raised a question that sat uncomfortably against his deepest political principles. The Constitution of the United States, as Jefferson had long argued, granted only those powers expressly written within it. Nowhere did it speak of purchasing foreign lands. Jefferson was a man of careful thought and deep conviction. His political philosophy rested on the principle that the federal government possessed only those powers the Constitution explicitly granted it. He had argued this view throughout his career, often forcefully. And now, holding the treaty for the largest land acquisition in the young nation's history, he found himself in a position that tested that philosophy in an acute and immediate way. He considered proposing a constitutional amendment to formally authorize the purchase. He drafted the language for one. But time pressed. Napoleon's willingness to sell might not last. The opportunity was extraordinary, and Jefferson was, above all, a man who could hold two thoughts in careful balance. In the end, he turned to the Constitution's grant of treaty-making power to the President and to Congress's authority to approve such treaties. He reasoned that nothing in the Constitution expressly prohibited the acquisition of foreign territory, and that the purchase could therefore proceed as a treaty without the need for amendment. James Madison's counsel helped reinforce this interpretation. Jefferson also framed the purchase in terms that reached beyond legal argument. It was a necessary protection for the nation's future, a guardian investment for generations not yet born. Congress ratified the treaty. The purchase stood. And in doing so, it established something beyond the transfer of land, a precedent for federal power over territorial expansion that would shape the course of American history for more than a century to come. The nation had grown overnight into something it had not quite planned to become. And the vast, breathing interior of the continent now waited, officially, on the other side of a signature. Even as the ink dried on the purchase agreement, Jefferson had already been turning his thoughts westward. Long before the Louisiana Territory officially changed hands, he had been nurturing a plan to send a small party of men into the interior of the continent. The purchase gave that plan new urgency and new scale. Jefferson's goals were layered and practical. He wanted the most direct and navigable water route across the continent, a passage that might link the United States to the commercial possibilities of the Pacific. He wanted detailed scientific records of the geography, the climate, the plants and animals, the soils and rivers of the new territory. He wanted diplomatic and trade relations established with the many native nations who inhabited those lands. He wanted American sovereignty asserted before European rivals, particularly Britain, could extend their own influence deeper into the interior. To lead this expedition, Jefferson turned to a man he knew intimately. Meriwether Lewis had been born in 1774 in Albemarle County, Virginia, not far from Monticello itself. He had served in the United States Army, rising to the rank of captain by 1800, and had formed a close friendship there with a fellow officer named William Clark. After Jefferson's election to the presidency, he had appointed Lewis as his private secretary, a position that placed Lewis in daily contact with the president, resident in the presidential mansion itself. Jefferson had come to trust him deeply, both as a man of action and as a careful observer. For a journey into an unknown interior, Jefferson believed he had found exactly the right person. Lewis accepted without hesitation. The question now was, who would stand beside him? Lewis chose William Clark as his co-commander, and the choice reflected both personal trust and practical wisdom. Clark had been born in Virginia in 1770, the ninth of 10 children in a family with deep frontier roots. He had served in the Kentucky militia and in the regular army, where he and Lewis had first formed their bond. Clark was a man of the outdoors in the most complete sense, skilled as a waterman, experienced as a cartographer, and gifted in his ability to communicate with Native American peoples in a manner that earned respect rather than suspicion. Together they assembled the Corps of Discovery, a specially formed United States Army unit of roughly 43 members. It included commissioned officers, non-commissioned sergeants and corporals, enlisted privates, and a complement of civilian specialists: hunters, boatmen, a blacksmith, a carpenter. Their equipment combined standard military issue with expedition-specific tools: keelboats and pirogues for the rivers, flintlock rifles and muskets, compasses, sextants, barometers, and specimen jars for scientific recording, and generous quantities of trade goods intended to facilitate diplomacy with the nations they would encounter. Among those who would make the journey was a man named York, an enslaved African American who had been the property of the Clark family since birth and had passed to William Clark in 1799. York would travel every mile of the expedition, performing the same physical labor as any other member, hunting game, hauling boats, building shelters. His vote would be counted alongside the others when the party decided where to winter. His presence, and the reactions it drew from the native nations they met, would prove to be one of the more quietly remarkable dimensions of the entire journey. The Corps of Discovery departed from Camp Dubois near present-day St. Charles, Missouri on May 14th, 1804. They moved up the Missouri River through what is now Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota, the great river curving and shifting beneath them as the land opened wider and the sky grew larger with every passing week. By late July, they were meeting the first native nations. A small band of Oto greeted them at a place they named Council Bluffs, the exchange courteous and the information gathered useful. Then, in late September of 1804, they encountered the Teton Sioux, the Lakota, whose chiefs, including a leader called Black Buffalo, confronted the party and demanded tribute for passage on the river. The moment grew tense. Lewis readied his men, Clark drew his sword. The standoff was eventually diffused through gifts and diplomatic explanation, and the Lakota allowed the party to continue. By late October, the expedition reached the Earth Lodge villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa on the upper Missouri, near what is now Bismarck, North Dakota. There they were welcomed warmly. The two nations knew Europeans well. They had been trading with white fur traders for years, and they understood the value of a new diplomatic relationship. The Corps built Fort Mandan across the river and settled in for the winter of 1804 to 1805. It was among the Mandan and Hidatsa that the expedition's next essential companion entered the story. Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trader, was recruited as an interpreter. He brought with him his young Shoshone wife, a woman the expedition would come to depend upon in ways they had not anticipated. Her name was Sacagawea. She had been born around 1788 in the Lemhi Valley of what is now central Idaho, among the northern Shoshone, a people whose lives moved with the rhythms of hunting, gathering, and fishing across the mountainous country of Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. When she was about 12 years old, a Hidatsa war party had captured her during a hunting trip and carried her back to their villages on the Missouri. There she had been given in marriage to Charbonneau. In the early weeks of 1805, while the Corps wintered at Fort Mandan, she gave birth to a son, Jean-Baptiste. When the expedition prepared to leave Fort Mandan in the spring, Sacagawea and Charbonneau were recruited to travel westward with the party. Her value was multilingual and navigational. She spoke Shoshone, Hidatsa, and some French, forming a chain of communication between the captains and the nations they would meet. When the expedition reached the territory of her own Shoshone people, her presence and her language would prove essential to securing the horses and guidance the Corps needed to cross the mountains. Beyond language, her presence carried meaning that words alone could not convey. A young woman traveling with an infant signaled to the many nations they encountered that the party came in peace. No war party moved with a mother and a child. Her presence helped open doors that military bearing alone might have kept closed. York's presence carried a different kind of significance. Many of the native nations they met, the Mandan, the Hidatsa, the Shoshone, the Nez Perce, had never seen a person of African descent. They gathered around him in awe, offered gifts, and in doing so often treated the entire expedition more favorably. His striking appearance becoming, quietly and unexpectedly, a diplomatic asset. The crossing of the Rocky Mountains was the expedition's most grueling trial. Moving southwest from the Missouri headwaters through the Bitterroot Range, the party attempted to follow a trail the Nez Perce knew well, the Lolo Trail, but initially lost it among the steep and snow-covered ridges. Temperatures fell below freezing. Food grew scarce. The men were exhausted from days of climbing on treacherous ground. Ammunition ran low, and the trail offered no easy path forward. It was the Nez Perce who made the crossing possible. On the Waipa Prairie, the expedition emerged from the mountains in a state near starvation. The Nez Perce received them with generosity, offering dried salmon and camas bread, restoring the party's strength. They then provided horses and skilled guides and showed the Corps the river route westward. Working together, they built canoes from pine logs and set them on the waters of the Clearwater River, which fed into the Snake and the Snake into the Columbia. On November the 15th, 1805, the Corps of Discovery reached the mouth of the Columbia River and looked out upon the Pacific Ocean. They had crossed the continent. They built a small winter camp they called Fort Clatsop, near what is now Astoria, Oregon, and spent the cold months there, recording specimens, observing the landscape and confirming what the journey had already made clear. There was no continuous inland waterway linking the continent's interior to the sea. The passage to the Pacific was a land crossing, a mountain crossing, and it was far more formidable than any map had yet suggested. In the spring of 1806, they turned eastward and began the long journey home, covering roughly 8,000 miles in total before reaching St. Louis in September of that year. The Corps of Discovery returned to St. Louis on September 23, 1806, to a reception of wide celebration. What they brought back was extraordinary. William Clark had produced a series of detailed maps, depictions of the Missouri and Columbia river systems, the mountain passes of the Rockies, the Continental Divide, that gave the United States its first coherent picture of the western interior. The journals kept by both Lewis and Clark, supplemented by the records of other members, described more than 70 Native American nations, catalogued roughly 200 new plant species, and documented approximately 120 previously unknown animals. They had, in the most literal sense, introduced the continent to itself. For the native nations who had met the Corps, the arrival had carried a different and more sobering meaning. The expedition had been, at its core, a formal assertion of American sovereignty over ancestral homelands. The medals distributed to native leaders, the speeches delivered by Lewis and Clark at council fires, had announced a distant government's claim to lands that nations had governed for generations. What followed in the decades ahead, the flood of traders, settlers, land cessions, and forced removals, had begun quietly with a keelboat moving up the Missouri River. After the expedition, Meriwether Lewis was appointed governor of Louisiana Territory, but struggled with depression and political conflict, dying in 1809 in circumstances widely regarded as suicide. Clark went on to serve as superintendent of Indian Affairs and later governor of the Missouri Territory, living until 1838. Sacagawea returned to her people and died in 1812. York remained enslaved for years after the journey before eventually gaining his freedom, his later life only partially recorded by history. What Lewis and Clark mapped as empty wilderness was, to the men who followed them next, not a land to be settled, but a land to be harvested. And in the decade that followed, a new and restless breed of American would venture into that interior, not with notebooks and compasses, but with traps, fur, and a willingness to live entirely outside the world they had left behind. Chapter 2. Mountain Men, Fur Traders, and the First Roads West. Long before the first wagon wheels ever carved ruts into the western soil, there was a different kind of traveler moving through the mountains. He carried very little. He moved quietly, and the land he crossed had no roads, no signposts, and no promises of safety. The fur trade era in North America was, at its heart, a vast commercial exchange. Indigenous trappers supplied beaver pelts and other animal skins to European merchants, who in return offered metal tools, knives, firearms, and textiles. This arrangement became one of the central pillars of the colonial economy, stretching far beyond the early fishing settlements along the Atlantic coast and reaching deep into the interior of a continent that most Europeans had barely glimpsed. The engine driving all of this was something surprisingly small and ordinary: a hat. In the great cities of Europe, fashionable men wore broad-brimmed felt hats that announced their status and wealth. The finest felt came from beaver fur, specifically the soft, dense underfur that hatters had learned to press and shape into a material both water-resistant and remarkably durable. The continental cocked hat of the Revolutionary era, the structured shako of military officers, the elegant high-crowned top hat that swept through the streets of London and Paris. All of them required beaver felt, and Europe's own beaver populations had long since been exhausted. So the eyes of merchants turned westward toward the great rivers and forests of North America, where beaver were still plentiful, still undisturbed, still quietly building their dams in the cold mountain streams. The trade that followed would reshape an entire continent. The men who built empires from this hunger for beaver felt were not always soldiers or explorers in the traditional sense. Some were sharp-minded merchants who never left their offices in New York or London. One such man was John Jacob Astor. Astor was born in a small German village in 1763 and arrived in New York in the 1780s with very little to his name. What he possessed instead was an extraordinary instinct for commerce and an ability to see, before almost anyone else, what a connected network of trade routes could become. He founded the American Fur Company and, over roughly 15 years, built it into a force that achieved near total control of the North American fur market. His trading network stretched from the Great Lakes all the way to the Pacific Northwest, exporting vast quantities of pelts to European markets hungry for the raw material that kept fashionable hats on fashionable heads. By the end of his career, Astor had become the United States' first multi-millionaire, and he would later channel that wealth into New York City real estate, cementing a legacy that outlasted the fur trade itself. But Astor was not alone in the mountains. His American Fur Company competed with the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, founded by William Henry Ashley. There was also the British Hudson's Bay Company, the Missouri Fur Company, the Bernard Pratt Company. Bent sent Vrain and Company along the Santa Fe route, and a cluster of smaller outfits all pressing into the same territory, all chasing the same animal through the same cold rivers. It was a crowded, competitive, and frequently dangerous world, one that demanded a particular kind of man to operate within it. The men who actually walked into the mountains were a different breed entirely from the merchants who financed them. They came from St. Louis, which in those years was a remarkable crossroads, a melting pot of French-Canadian voyageurs, American frontiersmen, Spanish traders, and men from the very bottom rungs of society, including escaped slaves, the homeless, and those with reasons to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the law. They were called mountain men, and their motivations were as varied as their origins. The promise of profit from the booming beaver pelt market drew many of them as trading companies sent hiring parties into the streets and taverns of St. Louis, looking for men willing to disappear into the wilderness for months at a time. But profit was not the only lure. Some were drawn by the romance of untamed wilderness. Others sought a personal freedom that settled society could not offer. Some simply needed to begin again somewhere that no one knew their name. Whatever brought them west, they stayed for reasons that were harder to explain. The mountains had a way of making a man feel that the rest of the world had grown impossibly small and distant. French-Canadian voyageurs and their Métis descendants, born of marriages between European traders and indigenous women, moved alongside them as essential partners. They served as packers and boatmen, guides and provisioners, transporting furs across the Rockies in two-wheeled carts and acting as cultural bridges between European trading posts and the native nations whose lands they all passed through. The fur trade of the American West was never solely an American enterprise. It was a layered multicultural world built on movement and interdependence. A mountain man traveled light because the mountains did not forgive excess weight. When he rode out from a trading post or a river town, his horse carried him and very little else beyond what survival absolutely required. He carried a rifle and powder horn, a reliable steel knife worn at his hip, a flint and steel kit for making fire, a small hatchet, a kettle for cooking, a buffalo skin blanket called an epichamere, and usually 6 beaver traps along with a vial of beaver castor to use as bait. His clothing was not the wool of eastern cities. It was buckskin, soft shirts and leggings cut from deer, elk, or buffalo hide, with moccasins that moved quietly over stone and mud in ways that leather boots never could. Survival in the mountains meant learning to read the land the way the people who had always lived there read it. Mountain men quickly adopted native survival techniques, learning to interpret broken branches and animal tracks, to follow river flow and bird flight patterns, to navigate by the position of the sun and stars, and to rely on seasoned indigenous guides to locate passes, water sources, and safe campsites. Their diet shifted from hardtack to a frontier cuisine built on fresh game and preserved foods, learned from their indigenous neighbors. Dried bison and elk, jerky, pemmican made from lean meat, pressed with dried fat and berries, and whatever wild roots or tubers the land offered in season. They adopted native snares and deadfalls for trapping, learned to stretch and dry beaver pelts on willow frames, and slowly became something that existed in no single cultural category. Part European, part indigenous, and entirely shaped by the wilderness they moved through. The mountain men did not move through the West in isolation from its inhabitants. They lived, traded, and often built families alongside the native nations whose territories they crossed, and these relationships were among the most defining features of the fur trade era. They dealt most frequently with the Shoshone, Bannock, Flathead, Ute, Nez Perce, Crow, Mandan, and Hidatsa peoples. These nations provided not only the bulk of the beaver pelts that kept the trade alive, but also horses, guides, and knowledge of the land that no amount of Eastern experience could replace. The Shoshone, the Ute, the Nez Perce, and the Crow were especially significant partners, while the Mandan and Hidatsa of the Upper Missouri supplied goods and provisions at fixed village sites that served as reliable waypoints. Marriage between mountain men and indigenous women was common, and it carried a weight and formality within tribal communities that Euro-American observers sometimes failed to recognize. These unions were conducted according to what was called the custom of the country, or in French-Canadian terms, à la façon du pays, a form of marriage rooted in the traditions of the woman's community, involving a bride price, reciprocal obligations, and the endorsement of her family. The arrangement gave the indigenous wife increased social standing and a powerful role as cultural intermediary. It gave the mountain man something equally valuable: kinship networks that smoothed trade negotiations, deepened his knowledge of the land, and created alliances that could mean the difference between safety and disaster in unfamiliar territory. These were not simply romantic arrangements. They were essential bonds that held the entire enterprise together. Among the figures who walked through this era, a handful rose to a kind of legendary status. Men whose names became attached to feats of endurance, exploration, and survival that seemed almost impossible to believe, even when reported firsthand. John Colter had been a member of the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery, and when that expedition ended, he stayed west. In the winter of 1807 and 1808, he set out alone into a region that would eventually become Yellowstone National Park. He crossed the Continental Divide and entered a landscape unlike anything a person of European descent had yet described. Steaming geysers erupting from the earth, hot springs shimmering in the cold air, the great jagged peaks of the Tetons rising against the sky. After months of solitary wandering through that extraordinary terrain, he was captured by a Blackfeet war party. In an episode that became known as Colter's Run, he escaped, fled through hostile country, and eventually reached safety at Fort Manuel. His reports of geothermal wonders were met with considerable skepticism when he returned. Men who had never been to those mountains found it difficult to believe that the earth itself could steam and boil, as he described. But Colter knew what he had seen, and he went on seeing it. The memory of those strange and silent geysers waiting patiently in the back of his mind, long after the fur trade had moved on, and the mountains had quieted again. His wanderings laid the groundwork for explorers who would follow decades later, and for the creation, in 1872, of the first national park in American history. The land had been there all along. Coulter was simply the first to carry its description home. If John Coulter's story was one of wonder, the story of Hugh Glass was one of something older and harder to name. A raw, almost incomprehensible determination to simply remain alive. In 1823, Glass was part of William Henry Ashley's trading expedition, moving through what is now southwestern South Dakota. While scouting ahead of the group for game, he surprised a mother grizzly bear and her 2 cubs. The bear attacked with the full force of maternal fury, lifting him, biting and slashing through his flesh, breaking his leg, ripping his scalp, puncturing his throat. By the time the bear was brought down, Glass lay in such a state that the men around him believed he could not possibly survive the next hour, let alone the days ahead. 2 companions were left behind to stay with him until he died. They did not stay. They left him on the riverbank and reported back that he had passed. Glass did not pass. He regained consciousness. He wrapped his torn and exposed injuries in the bear's own skin, allowed maggots to clean the deeper wounds, ate berries and roots and scraps of meat he found near wolf kills, and began to crawl. Over roughly 6 weeks, he covered more than 200 miles across hostile terrain, moving mostly on his elbows and knees until he reached Fort Kiowa and safety. He survived. He later found the men who had abandoned him, and he forgave them. The story of Hugh Glass traveled through the West like smoke, carried in the voices of trappers who gathered around fires and told it to one another in the long mountain winters, as if the telling itself was a kind of protection against the darkness outside. Not all of the era's great figures were defined by survival against nature's violence. Jedediah Smith was defined instead by movement, by a seemingly inexhaustible need to cross the next ridge, find the next valley, and chart the next unknown horizon. Smith was born in 1799, and his career as a frontiersman and fur trader lasted barely a decade before a Comanche ambush on the Santa Fe Trail ended his life in 1831. In those few years, he accomplished more geographic exploration than almost any American before or since. He was the first American to travel overland to California, the first to cross the Sierra Nevada from west to east, the first to reach the Oregon coast and the Columbia River by an overland coastal route. He rediscovered and publicized South Pass, the broad, gentle crossing of the Continental Divide in Wyoming, and proved it a practical corridor for wagons, a fact that would matter enormously to the thousands of families who followed in his footsteps years later. He survived the Arikara attack of 1823, the Mojave massacre of 1827, and the Umpqua massacre of 1828. He was, by any measure, a difficult man to kill, until he wasn't. Thomas Fitzpatrick, known as Broken Hand after a gun accident mangled his left hand, partnered with Smith to lead trappers across South Pass, and later married an Arapaho woman, learned multiple tribal languages, and eventually served as a guide and Indian agent whose knowledge of the Western interior was unmatched. And Kit Carson, who began his career with William Sublet's trapping outfits in the late 1820s, would carry the mountain man tradition forward into the era of wagon trains and government surveys, becoming one of the most recognized names in the American West. Once a year, the solitary world of the mountain man opened up. Once a year, the silence of the high country gave way to something altogether different. From 1825 to 1840, the annual rendezvous gathered trappers, mountain men, company agents, and Native American traders into a temporary city that appeared in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains each summer, most often in what is now Wyoming, though the exact location shifted from year to year. Mule trains laden with whiskey, ammunition, clothing, blankets, tobacco, and other goods arrived from the east. Trappers arrived from every direction, carrying the furs they had collected through the long mountain winter. What followed was part market fair, part festival, and part reunion. Pelts were weighed and traded for supplies. Prices were negotiated and debts settled. Rifles were fired in shooting contests. Knives and tomahawks were thrown at wooden targets. Songs were sung and tall tales were told around fires that burned through the mountain nights. Native American men and women came to trade, to socialize, and sometimes to formalize marriages. Families of trappers gathered together. European travelers who had come west, seeking the romance of the frontier, wandered through the temporary settlement with wide eyes. The rendezvous was a unique cultural phenomenon, a place where Euro-American frontier customs and indigenous traditions met, overlapped, and blended in ways that no other institution of the era could quite replicate. It was commercial and communal, competitive and celebratory all at once. And then, as the summer turned and the mule trains departed with their loads of fur, the gathering dissolved as quickly as it had appeared, and each man drifted back into the mountains alone. But no era lasts forever, and the world that had sustained the mountain men was already quietly dissolving around them, even as they lived within it. By the close of the 1830s, beaver had grown scarce across the Rocky Mountains. Trappers reported streams that had once been thick with the animals now running quiet and empty. The pressure of relentless trapping had brought the beaver population to the edge of collapse, and prices for pelts had begun to fall in response to the shrinking supply. Then, in the early 1840s, the fashion houses of Europe made a decision that sealed the trade's fate entirely. Silk hats had begun to replace beaver felt as the preferred material for stylish headwear. Within roughly 20 years, by the mid-1860s, the demand for beaver pelts had largely vanished. The market that had once moved mountains, literally shaping the routes and settlements of an entire continent, simply ceased to exist. The effect on the men who had built their lives around that market was immediate and profound. Many were left without income, without a purpose that matched their particular and extraordinary skills. They could not go back to the towns they had left. Many had been gone too long and changed too much, but the mountains had given them something that could not be taken away. They knew the land. They knew its passes and its rivers, its water sources, and its seasonal rhythms. They had carried that knowledge for years in their own bodies, moving through terrain that most Americans could not have located on a map. That knowledge, it turned out, was worth more than any pile of pelts. The collapse of the fur trade did not end the mountain man's usefulness to the westward moving nation. It transformed it. When the fur trade collapsed, the mountain men did not disappear. They pivoted, as they had always pivoted, reading the terrain in front of them and finding the best way through. Many became guides for the wagon trains that were beginning to roll westward along routes they themselves had charted. Their intimate knowledge of South Pass, of Bridger Pass, of the sublet cutoff of Landers Road, the passes and valleys they had moved through for years with only a horse and a few traps, made them invaluable to families attempting to cross the same ground with loaded wagons and children in tow. Jim Bridger opened a trading post on the Oregon Trail itself, supplying emigrants with the goods they needed to complete their journey. Kit Carson guided John C. Fremont's government surveying expeditions along routes that became the official roads of westward expansion. The geographic knowledge these men carried, descriptions of river courses, mountain passes, tribal territories, water sources, and seasonal conditions, flowed outward into maps, journals, newspaper accounts, and government reports. Wall maps in territorial offices were updated with information that had first been gathered by a man alone in the mountains, with no instrument more sophisticated than his own eyes. In the popular press, mountain men had already become something larger than themselves. Tabloids and dime novels turned figures like Jedediah Smith and Kit Carson into national celebrities, embodiments of the rugged individualism and pioneering spirit that the young nation was busy mythologizing about itself. The trails the mountain men had blazed with their solitary footsteps were about to be worn wide by something far larger, as thousands of ordinary American families loaded everything they owned into canvas-covered wagons and pointed them westward toward a coast most of them would never see until they arrived. Chapter 3: Manifest Destiny, the Oregon Trail and the Gold Rush. Sometime in the quiet middle of the 19th century, an idea settled over the United States like a long, slow breath. It was not a sudden thing. It had been gathering for years in the writings of politicians and clergymen, in the speeches of senators, and the dreams of farmers who looked westward past the edge of their modest fields and imagined something more. By 1845, that idea had a name. A journalist named John L. O'Sullivan gave it to the world in the pages of his periodical, the United States Magazine and Democratic Review. He wrote that it was the manifest destiny of the American nation to overspread the continent allotted by Providence, to spread liberty and republican government from one ocean to the other. The phrase caught in the air like smoke and did not leave. O'Sullivan had drawn together strands of thought that had been present since the founding of the Republic. Thomas Jefferson had spoken of an empire of liberty. John Quincy Adams had carried that vision forward. Andrew Jackson had acted upon it with the forced removal of native peoples from their homelands. And now, in the decade of the 1840s, the doctrine had found its fullest expression, embraced by President James K. Polk and a generation of Americans who believed, with great sincerity and great blindness, that their nation had been chosen by a higher power to fill a continent. Woven through that belief was something darker and quieter, something that rarely spoke its name aloud, but was always present. The ideology of manifest destiny rested on a racial foundation, one that placed the Anglo-Saxon people at the summit of human civilization and cast indigenous nations, Black Americans, and all others deemed outside that narrow circle as peoples to be displaced, assimilated, or erased. The dream of westward expansion was bright on its surface and shadowed beneath. For all the grandeur of its language, manifest destiny was also driven by something far more immediate and human. People were struggling. The years following the Panic of 1837 had left deep wounds across the eastern states and the Midwest. Banks had collapsed. Wages had fallen by nearly 40% in some regions. Unemployment had climbed to heights that made everyday survival a kind of daily negotiation. In the older states, land was costly and already crowded, and for the younger sons of farming families there was little to inherit and less to hope for in the places where they had been born. Across the Mississippi Valley, farmers watched the prices of wheat and corn fall below what it cost to grow them. Harvests that should have meant comfort instead meant debt. Meanwhile, the population of the nation was growing steadily, pressing against the limits of what the eastern seaboard and the old frontier could absorb. And for particular groups, the conditions were not merely difficult, but dangerous. Mormons who had faced persecution and violence across Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois were searching for a place where they might practice their faith in peace. Free Black Americans navigating a nation that offered them little legal protection and less welcome were likewise drawn by the possibility of something different. Into this landscape of economic strain and social pressure came reports, some exaggerated and some breathlessly accurate, of the land that lay beyond the Missouri River. Land that was said to be fertile beyond imagination. Land that cost nearly nothing. Wide valleys where crops grew without the labor of clearing stone or felling ancient timber. The promise of the West, real and embellished in equal measure, began to pull at those who had little left to lose and a great deal left to imagine. 3 great roads reached westward from the edge of the settled United States, and each one carried its own particular current of human hope. The most traveled of them all began in the river towns of Missouri. Places like Independence and St. Joseph and Council Bluffs, where emigrants gathered in the warming weeks of spring to organize themselves into companies before the journey could begin. From those muddy, bustling launching points, the Oregon Trail unfolded northwestward across the Great Plains, over the rolling skin of the continent, through the passes of the Rocky Mountains, and down at last into the green promise of the Pacific Northwest. It ended at Oregon City, more than 2,000 miles from where it had begun. South of the Oregon Trail, branching away at a junction deep in present-day Idaho, near a place called Fort Hall, the California Trail split off toward the southwest, following the Humboldt River across the dry basin of Nevada, before climbing the steep wall of the Sierra Nevada and descending into the valley where Sutter's Fort waited. This route would become the artery of the gold rush. And then there was the Santa Fe Trail, which ran southwest from Independence across the southern plains toward New Mexico, connecting the United States with the old Mexican provinces and eventually reaching as far as Chihuahua. Each trail carried a different kind of traveler toward a different kind of dream. Farmers bound for Oregon, merchants bound for Santa Fe, and later, in a great wave of gold-hungry thousands, prospectors bound for California. Organized wagon train emigration had begun tentatively in the mid-1830s, and by 1843, a company of roughly 1,000 pioneers left Missouri for Oregon, marking the moment when the trickle became a current, and the current began its slow, inevitable swelling into something much larger. A typical wagon train was its own small, moving world. It consisted of perhaps 20 to 30 families, somewhere between 150 and 200 people, organized into a company of 40 to 50 covered wagons. Each wagon was pulled by a team of 4 to 6 oxen, sometimes mules, and the full company moved with a living tide of draft animals, milk cows, and the accumulated possessions of families who had sold or left behind nearly everything else. Provisions were measured carefully. Each person carried roughly 200 pounds of flour and 100 pounds of bacon, supplemented by dried apples and peaches, beans, coffee, sugar, cornmeal, and baking soda. A Dutch oven, a water keg, a medicine chest, powder and lead for the rifles, small comforts tucked into corners between barrels. The day began before dawn. A bugle or a rifle shot at 4 in the morning would stir the camp into motion. Cattle were rounded up. Breakfast was prepared over open fires, corn porridge perhaps, or strips of bacon sizzling in a pan. By 7, the wagons were rolling, the signal given, and the long line began to move. The pace was unhurried by necessity, roughly 15 miles a day on good terrain, stretching to 20 on days when the weather and the ground cooperated. Women were the quiet engine of it all. They cooked and baked and churned butter and cared for the sick. They walked long miles ahead of the wagons, rather than endure the jarring ride inside. When the trail demanded it, they drove the oxen themselves, yoked the teams, loaded firearms, and stood guard through the night. The evenings brought a different rhythm. Fires lit, fiddles and banjos played, children running between the wagons, and the wide, dark sky of the plains arching overhead in silence. The trail had landmarks that became as familiar as scripture to those who traveled it, mile markers of a journey measured not in comfort, but in endurance. Out on the windswept plains of what is now western Nebraska, Chimney Rock rose from the earth like a solitary tower, its distinctive silhouette visible for days before a wagon reached it, and days after it fell behind. Travelers wrote of it in their journals with a kind of wondering relief, as though the strangeness of its shape confirmed that they were still moving, still making progress toward something real. Nearby, the broken cliffs of Scott's Bluff and Courthouse Rock marked the slow geological transition from open prairie to the approaching mountains. Independence Rock in Wyoming, a great rounded dome of granite, had become known as the Great Register of the West, its surface covered in the carved and painted names of thousands who had passed before. To reach it before mid-July was a good sign. To arrive later meant the risk of winter catching the party in the high country. The forts were the other kind of landmark. Fort Kearny and Fort Laramie in the east, Fort Bridger and Fort Hall further along, places where a traveler could rest a few days, repair a broken wheel, resupply with flour or salt, and hear news from the trail ahead. South Pass in Wyoming, the gentle saddle of the Continental Divide, marked both a geographical and emotional crossing. Here the waters flowed toward the Pacific rather than the Atlantic. Here, roughly halfway through the journey, the pull of what lay ahead finally began to outweigh the pull of what had been left behind. Fort Boise on the Snake River announced the entry into the Columbia Basin, and the trading post at the Dalles, where the river narrowed and the current quickened, told the traveler that Oregon was near. The trail was not only beautiful, it was, in stretches, genuinely deadly. Cholera was the great invisible terror of the overland migration. It swept through the jumping-off towns of Missouri in the early 1850s and followed the emigrant columns westward along the Platte and North Platte rivers, moving through camps like a cold wind. A traveler could be healthy in the morning and dying by nightfall. The disease killed hundreds to thousands among the estimated 350,000 people who walked the trail in the years of peak migration, accounting for more deaths than any other single cause. There were other killers too: typhoid fever, dysentery, smallpox, measles, scurvy from the long weeks without fresh food. And the river crossings, the Kansas River, the Platte, the Green River in Wyoming, the Columbia. All of them had to be forded or crossed by improvised raft, and the currents were swift and cold and indifferent. 37 deaths were recorded at the Green River crossing in a single year. Graves appeared beside the trail with such regularity that some stretches of the route must have felt less like a road and more like a long, thin cemetery. The overall mortality rate for the migration has been estimated at between 6 and 10% of all travelers. Most of those deaths were quiet, anonymous, and unremarked, except in the journals of those who had traveled alongside the fallen. And then there was the story that became the cautionary myth of the entire overland movement. In the spring of 1846, a wagon party of 87 people left the Midwest for California, took a new and untested cutoff through the Sierra Nevada, and were trapped by an early heavy snowfall near what is now Donner Lake. When rescue parties finally broke through in February of 1847, 48 people had survived. The ordeal entered American memory and did not leave. Those who survived the journey and descended at last into the Willamette Valley of Oregon found a landscape that seemed to justify every mile of the ordeal. The soil there was famously fertile, celebrated in the reports of Hudson's Bay Company traders who had been farming the valley for years before the Great Migration began. Crops grew with an abundance that seemed almost unearned to farmers who had spent their lives coaxing harvests from the worn-out soils of the East. The provisional government that the settlers had organized for themselves in 1843 had already established a land law offering generous parcels to those who settled and improved the land. The Donation Land Act of 1850 formalized that arrangement, granting 640 acres to a married couple, 320 to a single adult, in exchange for several years of residence and cultivation. For families who had come from places where a few dozen acres of exhausted farmland was the ceiling of what a person could hope to own, the scale of it was almost incomprehensible. But the story of those who came was never only the story of what they found. The emigrants who walked and rode across 2,000 miles of continent were overwhelmingly white Americans of European descent, though African Americans made up roughly 3% of the overland companies, a mix of enslaved people traveling as the property of their owners and free black men and women seeking something better. The economic range was wide, from relatively prosperous landowners who could outfit a well-supplied wagon to families who had pooled everything they owned just to afford the journey. And the land they settled had not been empty. It had been home to native peoples whose presence the new arrivals acknowledged sometimes, accommodated sometimes, and, in too many cases, simply erased. While settlers were finding their way to Oregon, the doctrine of manifest destiny was playing out on a far larger and more violent stage to the south. The annexation of Texas in 1845 had inflamed relations between the United States and Mexico to a point just short of breaking. Mexico had never recognized Texas's independence after the 1836 revolution, and it regarded the American annexation as an act of aggression against a province it still considered its own. The dispute over where Texas ended and Mexico began sharpened the crisis further. The United States insisted that the Rio Grande formed the southern boundary of Texas. Mexico held that the border lay at the Nueces River, well to the north. The strip of land between those two rivers became the contested ground on which the war was made. President James K. Polk, who believed as completely as any man of his era in the American right to continental dominion, ordered U.S. troops to occupy the disputed territory in early 1846. When Mexican cavalry attacked the American detachment, Polk went to Congress with the claim that American blood had been shed on American soil, and a declaration of war followed. What followed was a conflict prosecuted across an enormous and varied geography. General Zachary Taylor won early victories at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, and later at Buena Vista. General Winfield Scott led the amphibious assault on Veracruz and drove his army inland through the mountain passes to Mexico City itself, fighting at Cerro Gordo and Churubusco and Chapultepec before the capital fell. In the west, Colonel Stephen Kearny swept through New Mexico and California with little resistance. Among the junior officers who earned their first combat experience in these campaigns were names the country would hear again: Ulysses Grant, Robert E. Lee, William Sherman. The war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2nd, 1848. Mexico ceded roughly 55% of its territory to the United States, an expanse that encompassed the present-day states of California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and portions of Colorado, Wyoming, and other states. In exchange, the United States paid $15 million in compensation and assumed approximately $3.25 million in claims by American citizens against the Mexican government. The Rio Grande was formally recognized as the southern border of Texas. The treaty also contained provisions for the Mexican nationals who remained within the newly acquired lands. They were to be given the choice of retaining their Mexican citizenship or becoming American citizens. And those who chose American citizenship were promised all the rights and protections that citizenship entailed. Their property was to be respected, their religion was to be protected, their civil rights were to be honored. In the years that followed, most of those promises dissolved quietly into the machinery of American expansion. Mexican landholders found their grants challenged in courts that were indifferent to their claims, lost their lands through legal maneuvers and outright fraud, and found themselves second-class inhabitants of a country that had guaranteed them equality. The territory was vast, and the opportunity it represented was real, but the human cost of its acquisition, borne by the Mexican people, by the native nations who had inhabited those lands for centuries, and by the enslaved people who were already caught up in the national argument about whether slavery would follow the flag westward, was immense and not often counted in the celebrations that followed. 9 days before the treaty was signed, something had already changed everything. On January 24th, 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall was inspecting the mill race of a sawmill being constructed for John Sutter on the South Fork of the American River in the foothills east of Sacramento. He noticed a sparkle in the water. He reached down and lifted small flakes of something heavy and yellow. Gold. Sutter, a Swiss-born landowner who had built a small empire in the Sacramento Valley, tried to keep the discovery quiet. He failed. By the summer of 1848, the news had reached San Francisco. By autumn, it had reached the eastern seaboard, carried in newspapers and letters and the breathless accounts of sailors newly arrived from California ports. President Polk confirmed the find in his December address to Congress. By then, the world was already moving. What followed was one of the largest and most rapid voluntary human migrations in recorded history. From the eastern United States, tens of thousands of men set out overland on the California Trail, or took ships south around Cape Horn or across the Isthmus of Panama. From Latin America, miners from the silver and copper districts of Sonora and Chile made their way northward by sea. From China, where the news traveled by merchant ship and consular report, and where California became known as Gold Mountain, thousands of young men crossed the Pacific. From Australia and New Zealand, from Britain and France and Germany, the word spread and the movement began. California's non-native population, which had numbered roughly 15,000 people in 1848, swelled past 100,000 by the end of 1849 and reached 250,000 by 1854. San Francisco grew from a settlement of 1,000 people into a city of 25,000 in less than 2 years. The mining camps that appeared in the California foothills were rough, provisional places. Tents and wooden shacks clustered along stream beds. Stores and saloons offered supplies at prices that would have seemed impossible back east. The work itself was grinding and often unrewarding. Early prospectors waded into streams with gold pans, swirling gravel and water in the patient search for color. Cradles and rockers increased the volume that could be processed. Sluice boxes linked in series allowed greater quantities of earth and water to be moved. As the easy placer gold thinned, hydraulic mining used high-pressure jets of water to strip entire hillsides. For every man who grew wealthy, many more found only dust. Disease moved through the crowded camps, smallpox and dysentery and scurvy from weeks without fresh food. Violence was common. With no formal law enforcement in the remote foothills, miners created their own codes and their own courts, drafting ordinances that defined claim boundaries and settled disputes. When those mechanisms failed, vigilante action filled the gap, sometimes against criminals, often against the most vulnerable. Native Californians, who had numbered perhaps 150,000 to 300,000 before the rush, were devastated. Miners and settlers killed tens of thousands. Disease swept through communities made vulnerable by displacement and hunger. The population of California's native peoples fell from roughly 150,000 in the mid-1840s to approximately 30,000 by the early 1870s, a collapse of around 80% in a single generation. California itself, driven into statehood by the sheer force of its sudden population, entered the Union as a free state on September 9th, 1850, setting off a fierce national debate about the balance between slave states and free that would simmer for the next decade. And in the exhausted, thinning gold fields, even as the first great wave of the rush receded, the wealth already extracted had already made its mark on the shape of a nation. As California's gold fields thinned and the boomtown chaos of the mining camps slowly gave way to something more permanent. A different kind of fortune was being discovered on the vast, open grasslands of Texas, one measured not in gold dust, but in cattle. And the men who would move those cattle across 1,000 miles of open country were about to create an image of the American West that would outlast everything that came before it. Chapter 4: Cowboys, Cattle Drives, and the Iron Road Across the Continent. When the guns of the Civil War finally fell silent, the state of Texas found itself in a peculiar and remarkable condition. Its fields and towns were worn by years of conflict, its economy fragile and uncertain. And yet, across its vast interior, something extraordinary had been quietly happening, without the help of any human hand. The longhorn cattle had been multiplying. For years, while men were away at war, while ranches sat empty and fences went unmended, the great herds had drifted and grazed and grown. By 1865, somewhere between 5 and 6 million head of wild longhorn cattle roamed the Texas frontier, most of them unbranded, unclaimed, and free. They moved through the grasses like slow rivers, unhurried and uncountable. It was one of the most remarkable accumulations of livestock the continent had ever seen, and almost no one had planned it. The cattle simply were. They had always been there in a sense, their lineage tracing back to the animals that Spanish explorers had brought to the New World centuries before. But now they existed in staggering numbers. And the question that slowly began to form in the minds of Texas ranchers was a simple one. What was to be done with them? In Texas, a single steer might fetch no more than $2 or $3, sometimes even less. There were too many cattle and too few buyers in a land still finding its footing. But far to the north and east, in the swelling cities of Chicago and St. Louis and New York, the story was entirely different. There, beef was scarce, demand was rising, and a single Texas steer could sell for $35, $40, sometimes $45. The arithmetic was not complicated. What was needed was a way to close the distance between the cattle that nobody wanted and the cities that desperately did. The trails that connected Texas to the distant markets of the north were not invented all at once. They grew slowly, worn into the earth by the hooves of thousands of cattle and the boots of the men who followed them. Among these routes, several would become legendary, their names woven permanently into the story of the American West. The most famous of all was the Chisholm Trail, a north-running corridor that began in the ranching districts near San Antonio and wound its way up through what is now Oklahoma, crossing the Red River and threading through the grasslands until it reached the Kansas railheads at Abilene, Ellsworth, and eventually Dodge City. It took its name from Jesse Chisholm, a Cherokee Scottish frontiersman and trader who had already blazed a wagon route through the territory to connect his trading posts, moving goods among the native peoples of the region. After his death in the spring of 1868, Texas cattle drovers adopted his route, and by April of 1869, the name had appeared in print. The trail bore his name from that point forward, long after the man himself was gone. Further west, Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving had cut a very different kind of path. In 1866, they combined their herds and drove them west from central Texas, across the harsh Llano Estacado, over the Pecos River and into New Mexico and Colorado, supplying army posts, settlers, and the Navajo reservation at Fort Sumner with beef. Their trail turned northward, reaching the cattle markets of Wyoming and connecting in time to the broader rail networks of the West. A third route, the Western Trail, pioneered in 1874 by drover John Lytle, traced a path past Fort Griffin and up toward Dodge City, offering an alternative when the Chisholm's eastern corridor had grown crowded. Each trail was a lifeline, a slow artery of commerce written across the open land. A typical cattle drive was not a simple undertaking. It required careful planning, steady nerves, and a willingness to endure conditions that would test any person's patience and endurance. A herd on the move might number anywhere from 1,500 to 2,500 cattle, managed by a crew of about 10 to 12 cowboys working under the authority of a trail boss who made the decisions that kept the whole enterprise alive. The trail boss was everything on the drive: navigator, mediator, problem solver, and final word in any dispute. Before the sun had fully risen each morning, the cowboys were already in motion. A quick breakfast of black coffee and hard biscuits, then out to saddle fresh horses from the remuda, the rotating string of spare mounts that kept exhausted animals from being ridden into the ground. The herd was organized with care. Point riders guided the lead cattle. Swing riders kept the middle flanks from drifting. Drag riders pushed the stragglers forward through the dust. And it was the dust, more than almost anything else, that defined the daily experience of a cattle drive. It rose in choking clouds from beneath thousands of hooves, coating everything: skin, clothing, teeth, lungs. Cowboys riding drag at the rear of the herd spent their days nearly invisible in the brown haze, breathing through bandanas, their eyes streaming. The food that sustained these men was simple and carried aboard the chuck wagon: beans, salted pork, coffee, dried potatoes, flour and lard, rice and dried onions. A skilled cook was as important to the drive as any cowboy, and on a good day might produce a peach cobbler or rice pudding that would be remembered for the rest of the journey. The nights brought their own rhythm: 2-hour guard shifts, softly singing to calm the herd under open skies, sleep on cold ground beneath the stars, then up again before dawn, to do it all once more. The hazards of the cattle trail were many, and they arrived without warning. Rivers that had seemed shallow and manageable could transform overnight after distant rains into rushing, churning floods, and a herd forced to cross such a river might lose animals, and sometimes men, to the current. Cowboys who entered the water had to move their horses through the press of panicked cattle, reading the currents and the animals at once, trusting their experience and their luck in equal measure. Stampedes were another constant threat. The longhorn was not a gentle creature by temperament, and the herd could be startled into full, thundering flight by something as small as a rattlesnake, a crack of lightning, or an unexpected sound in the dark. When a herd stampeded at night, the cowboys rode hard to turn the lead cattle and curl the herd back on itself, risking their horses' legs in the darkness, trusting the animal beneath them to stay upright on unknown ground. Disease moved through herds and through men alike. The most feared ailment among the cattle was Texas fever, carried by ticks that the longhorns themselves were largely immune to, but that killed the native cattle of Kansas and Missouri with devastating speed. It was Texas fever, as much as anything else, that eventually pushed the drives westward and prompted farmers and ranchers in the receiving states to resist the approach of the trail herds. For the cowboys themselves, the physical toll was relentless. Rheumatism settled into joints battered by cold and wet. Hemorrhoids were common among men who spent 12 to 14 hours a day in the saddle. Skin burned and cracked, lungs filled with alkali dust. And through all of it, the drive pressed on, because the cattle had to reach the railhead, and the season would not wait. At the end of the long trail, after weeks of dust and river crossings and sleepless nights, the cattle drives arrived at the Kansas railhead towns. These were places unlike anything the open prairie had prepared a cowboy for. They were loud and bright and chaotic, full of possibility and danger in equal measure. Abilene was the first and, for a time, the greatest of them. It was transformed almost entirely by the vision of one man, Joseph McCoy, an Illinois entrepreneur who recognized the profit waiting at the intersection of Texas cattle and eastern rail lines. In 1868, McCoy chose the small settlement of Abilene, sitting along the Kansas Pacific Railroad, and built stockyards, loading pens, and a rail platform capable of handling thousands of cattle. He advertised aggressively to Texas cattlemen and directed the trails toward his depot. Within a few years, Abilene had become the primary point at which Texas longhorns were loaded onto trains heading east, and McCoy himself would eventually be elected the town's mayor. By the early 1870s, newer railheads at Wichita and Ellsworth drew business away from Abilene. And after 1876, Dodge City rose to prominence when the Santa Fe Railroad arrived. Dodge City became the most notorious of all the cow towns, its name attached permanently to images of gunfights and rough justice. Its Boot Hill Cemetery an ironic monument to those who did not survive their time there. Famous lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson walked its streets and attempted to impose order on a town that received thousands of trail-weary cowboys each season. Wichita, in contrast, developed into a more settled community, one that prided itself on civic order, even as it accommodated the saloons and gambling halls that drew the cattle trade. Each of these towns was, in its way, a doorway through which the wealth of the Texas plains passed on its way to become beef on eastern tables. The cowboy of the American West was not born from thin air. His skills, his tools, his language, and his way of working with cattle were inherited from a tradition centuries older than the cattle drives themselves. The vaquero tradition of Mexico was the true origin of everything that would become recognizable as cowboy culture. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the New World in the early 16th century, they brought cattle, horses, and Iberian ranching methods with them. On the great haciendas of New Spain, indigenous and mestizo men were trained to manage these animals on horseback. And from this beginning, the vaquero emerged, a horseman of extraordinary skill, whose entire working life was organized around the movement and management of cattle. The vaquero used the rawhide riata for roping, controlled his horse with the bozal and the spade-bit bridle, wore wide-brimmed sombreros to block the fierce sun, wrapped his legs in leather chaparreras to protect them from brush, and applied the brand, the marca, to identify livestock. The techniques he developed for rounding up, cutting, and driving cattle were refined over generations into something approaching an art form. When Anglo settlers began moving into Texas, California, and New Mexico in increasing numbers, particularly after the Mexican-American War, they hired vaqueros, learned from them, and gradually absorbed their methods. The word vaquero itself softened in the American mouth into buckaroo. The lazo became the lasso. The rancho became the ranch. The corral kept its name entirely. Roughly 1 in 8 working cowboys during the classic cattle drive era was a Mexican vaquero or tejano, and their influence on every aspect of the cowboy's craft was immeasurable. The chaps, the saddle, the rope, the spur, the roundup, all of it flowed from the long tradition of men on horseback in the grasslands of New Spain. The cowboy of the cattle drive era was a far more diverse figure than the mythology that later grew around him would suggest. Approximately 1/4 of all working cowboys during the classic trail drive period were Black Americans, men who had come west in the years after emancipation seeking wages, independence, and a life defined by work rather than by the rigid cruelties of the post-Reconstruction South. On the trail, they often found something closer to equity than anything available in the towns that lined the route. Pay was generally comparable to what white cowboys earned, and the hierarchy of the drive was shaped more by job role and experience than by race. Among the most celebrated of these men was Nat Love, born in Tennessee in June of 1854, who left a plantation at the age of 12 and joined a cattle drive in 1866. He worked on ranches across Texas and Arizona, earning the nickname Red River Dick for his marksmanship, and in 1876 won a series of roping and shooting contests in Deadwood, South Dakota, where he claimed the name Deadwood Dick, a title he later used as the headline of his 1907 autobiography. Another figure of extraordinary significance was Bill Pickett, born in 1870, who would go on to pioneer the rodeo event known as bulldogging, leaping from horseback onto a running steer and wrestling it to the ground. His technique, derived from observing herding dogs, earned him the nickname the Dusky Demon and made him a celebrated performer in Wild West shows across the country. He would eventually become the first black inductee into the National Rodeo Hall of Fame. Yet even on the trail, equality had its limits. In the cowtowns, black cowboys often faced separate entrances, exclusion from restaurants, and the familiar indignities of a society that had not yet reconciled its ideals with its practices. The trail offered more than the plantation, but it did not offer everything. The cattle drive era that had transformed the American West did not last forever. It ended not with a dramatic collapse, but with a quiet and inevitable obsolescence, the way many eras end, gradually and then and all at once. The instrument of its ending was the same technology that had made it possible in the first place: the railroad. As the rail lines pushed deeper into Texas through the 1870s, the logic of driving cattle hundreds of miles north on foot began to dissolve. Cattle could now be loaded onto trains closer to where they were raised, shipped quickly and efficiently to eastern markets, without the weeks of walking, the river crossings, the stampedes, the diseases. Barbed wire was spreading across the open range at the same time, closing off the unfenced corridors that the drives had relied upon. And the problem of Texas fever, the tick-borne disease that killed northern cattle when longhorns passed through, had made receiving states increasingly hostile to the drives, pushing them further and further toward routes that made less and less economic sense. The first direct rail connection between Texas and the national network arrived in 1873, and from that point the long drives began their slow retreat. By approximately 1885, the classic cattle drive era was effectively over. The great trails that had carried millions of cattle northward over 2 decades were becoming overgrown. Their ruts softened by rain, their crossings no longer churned by hooves. The men who had ridden them dispersed into ranching, farming, town life, or further west. What remained was the memory, and in time, the legend. A legend so powerful and so deeply woven into the American imagination that it would outlast the reality by more than a century, shaping how a nation understood its own character and its own past. While the cattle trails were being worn into the earth across the southern plains, something equally transformative was being built across the entire width of the continent. The Transcontinental Railroad was one of the great undertakings of the 19th century, an ambition so large that it required the full weight of the federal government to make it possible. The Pacific Railroad Acts of 1862 and 1864, signed into law by President Lincoln, authorized 2 companies to do what had never been done before. The Union Pacific would build westward from Omaha, Nebraska. The Central Pacific would build eastward from Sacramento, California. Together, they would connect the Atlantic and Pacific coasts by iron rail. To make it financially possible, the government offered extraordinary incentives. Land grants of 10 alternating sections per mile of completed track, later doubled to 20, gave the railroads enormous tracts of Western territory to sell for development. Government bonds at 6% interest were issued at rates that varied with the difficulty of the terrain. $16,000 per mile on the level plains, $32,000 in the plateau country, and $48,000 in the mountains. The railroads were also permitted to issue their own first mortgage bonds. It was one of the largest public subsidies in American history to that point, a recognition that the private market alone could not finance an undertaking of such scale. The 2 companies set to work, each racing to lay as many miles of track as possible, since every mile meant more land and more bond money. What followed was a construction effort of breathtaking scale, involving tens of thousands of workers, millions of pounds of iron rail, and some of the most difficult terrain on the continent. The Central Pacific's challenge was the Sierra Nevada, and it fell to the men who built through those mountains to accomplish something that many had believed impossible. The workforce that made it possible was overwhelmingly Chinese. By 1866 and 1867, as many as 12 to 15,000 Chinese laborers, drawn largely from the coastal provinces of Guangdong and Fujian, men who had first come to California during the gold rush years, made up roughly 90% of the Central Pacific's employees. They were paid approximately $26 a month when they first arrived, later raised to $35, while white workers received considerably more and were provided with meals and housing at no extra cost. Chinese workers had to pay for their own food and lodging from their wages and were consistently assigned the most dangerous work. At Cape Horn, they were lowered on rope scaffolds down sheer granite faces rising more than 1,000 feet above the American River, chipping and blasting a roadbed into rock that had never been touched. At the Summit Tunnel, Tunnel 6, they bored through 1,600 feet of solid granite at more than 7,000 feet of elevation, advancing sometimes less than a foot a day using black powder and, briefly, on-site mixed nitroglycerin, a volatile compound that proved too dangerous and was quickly abandoned. They worked in 3 rotating shifts, around the clock. In winter, avalanches buried their camps. Men were found in spring when the snow melted. More than 1,000 Chinese laborers died during the construction of the Central Pacific segment, a mortality rate estimated at somewhere between 7 and 10% of the workforce. Their names were rarely recorded. In the famous photograph taken at the Golden Spike ceremony, they are largely absent. What endures is the mountain they moved through. On the 10th of May, 1869, at a place called Promontory Summit in the Utah Territory, the 2 iron roads met. Leland Stanford, co-founder of the Central Pacific, drove a 17.5-carat gold spike into the last tie, joining the tracks of the eastbound Union Pacific and the westbound Central Pacific into a single continuous line from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific. The ceremony was celebrated with champagne, speeches, and the click of telegraph wires that carried the news instantly to cities across the nation. Church bells rang. Crowds gathered in the streets. The continent had been crossed by iron. What had once taken 6 months by overland wagon, an arduous, dangerous journey across deserts and mountains, could now be accomplished in roughly a week. The price of a transcontinental passenger ticket fell from around $1,000 to about $150. Freight costs dropped dramatically, making Western trade practical where it had once been nearly impossible. In the years and decades that followed, other transcontinental lines would follow, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe reaching Los Angeles by 1881, the Northern Pacific arriving at Puget Sound in 1883, the Great Northern completed in 1893. Each new line opened fresh corridors of settlement and commerce, knitting the vast Western territories ever more tightly into the economic fabric of the nation. But the railroad's reach was not gentle in all its effects. Across the Great Plains, the iron lines carried hunters who decimated the great buffalo herds that had sustained plains peoples for generations, reducing populations of 12 to 30 million animals to a few hundred within a decade, severing the material and spiritual foundation of entire nations. The continent was drawing together, and for those who had always called it home, something irreplaceable was slipping away. But even as the iron rails drew the continent together and cattle fortunes rose and fell with the season, a deeper and more ancient conflict was reaching its most violent and tragic expression. Out on the open plains and in the mountain valleys, where sovereign nations fought with everything they had to hold on to worlds that were disappearing beneath them. Chapter 5. The Frontier Wars, Native Nations, Broken Treaties, and the Last Free Peoples of the Plains. Long before the first shots of the Frontier Wars were ever fired, there existed between the United States government and the native nations of North America a formal system of agreements, documents written in careful language, signed by careful hands, and meant to carry the weight of law. These were the treaties. Under the Constitution of the United States, treaties were considered the supreme law of the land, and the native nations who signed them were treated, at least in principle, as sovereign peoples entering into solemn diplomatic compacts with a sovereign nation. The Senate was required to ratify each agreement. Tribal boundaries were defined. Land was ceded. Promises of compensation and protection were set down in ink. The treaty traditions stretched back to the earliest days of the Republic, continued from habits the British had established before the Revolutionary War. And for a time, the system carried a kind of formal dignity, a recognition, however imperfect, that the peoples of the plains and forests held rights that could not simply be ignored. But from the beginning, the treaties were fragile things. Many were never properly ratified. Others were signed by tribal representatives who lacked the authority under their own laws to bind their nations. Promises of annuities went unfulfilled. Boundaries were ignored. Settlers and soldiers pressed forward regardless of what the documents said. And as the decades passed, Congress found ways to quietly set aside what had once been solemnly pledged. Through statutes, through the doctrine of congressional plenary power over Indian affairs, and finally, in 1871, by formally ending the recognition of tribes as independent nations capable of treaty-making at all. What remained were the treaties already signed, their promises still technically alive, still cited in courtrooms even today, and the long, sorrowful story of how those promises were broken one by one across the wide face of the plains. Among the many treaties negotiated with the peoples of the Great Plains, 3 stand out as especially consequential. Agreements that shaped not only the landscape of the West, but the arc of the wars that followed. The first was the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1851, which brought together the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Crow, and other nations to define their territorial boundaries and to allow emigrants safe passage along the Oregon and California trails. It was an attempt to impose a map onto a world that had always existed without such hard lines. The second was the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867, sometimes called the Treaty of the Little Arkansas, which pressed the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Apache, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho to accept reservations in what is now Oklahoma, with promises of supplies and protection in return for their relocation from ancestral lands. But it was the third treaty, the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, that proved most momentous of all. Signed in the aftermath of a war the United States had not won, it established the Great Sioux Reservation, a vast expanse stretching from the Missouri River westward to include the sacred Black Hills. The language of the treaty was unambiguous. These lands were set apart for the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Lakota people. Annual annuities were promised. Hunting rights were guaranteed. The Bozeman Trail was to be closed, its forts abandoned. For a brief, quiet season, it seemed as though something like peace had been reached. A formal acknowledgement, however reluctant, that the Lakota and their allies had rights the United States was bound to honor. That season would not last long. The Black Hills held gold, and gold had a way of dissolving even the most solemn promises. Before the wars, before the treaties, before the soldiers and the railroads and the hunters arrived in their thousands, the Great Plains were home to something almost beyond imagining. A sea of living creatures moving across the grasslands in numbers that darkened the horizon and shook the earth with their passing. These were the bison. Estimates vary, as they always do when measuring something so immense. But scholars generally agree that before large-scale hunting began, somewhere between 30 million and 60 million bison roamed North America. The most cautious figures settle near 30 million. Whatever the precise count, the herds were vast enough that early travelers on the plains described watching them pass for days without interruption. A river of dark, shaggy bodies stretching from one edge of sight to the other. For the nations of the plains, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Comanche, and many others, the bison was not merely food. It was the center of everything. The meat sustained life through the long winters. The hides became robes, blankets, and the great curved walls of teepees. Sinew and tendon were fashioned into bowstrings and cordage. Bones were carved into tools and ornaments. Even dried dung served as fuel where wood was scarce. And beyond all these material uses, the bison occupied a sacred place in the ceremonies, the myths, and the creation stories of the peoples who lived alongside them. The animal spirit was honored. Its abundance was celebrated. The relationship between the people and the bison was not one of simple consumption, but of profound mutual belonging. To understand what was about to happen, what was deliberately made to happen, one must first understand how completely these nations were woven into the life of the bison, and how much would unravel when the herds began to fall. What brought the bison herds to the edge of extinction was not the passage of centuries, but the fury of a few decades. In the 1870s, commercial buffalo hunting became one of the defining industries of the American West, driven by a demand that reached across the ocean. In the factories of the United States and in England and Germany, machines needed leather belts to run, wide, strong belts cut from thick hides, and the bison of the Great Plains provided them in abundance. Transcontinental railroads, completed in the years after the Civil War, made it cheap and fast to ship hides from the heart of the plains to the markets of the East and beyond. Hunters armed with long-range rifles could kill hundreds of animals in a single day, earning $2 to $3 per hide and about 25 cents per tongue, which was sold as a popular delicacy. The meat was left to rot where the animals fell. Firms were shipping hundreds of thousands of hides each winter season. By 1870, an estimated 2 million bison were killed in a single year. Between 1872 and 1874, roughly 5,000 bison were killed every single day. some 5.5 million animals in 3 years. But the killing was not only commercial in nature. Senior army officers were explicit about what they intended. General William Tecumseh Sherman publicly suggested that troops be ordered to shoot bison until the animals became too scarce to support the Indian nations. General Philip Sheridan and other commanders gave soldiers license to kill as many animals as possible, sometimes for sport, leaving carcasses across the plains. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Henry Pratt later recalled that the general destruction of the buffalo had been ordered as a military measure, because without the bison, the tribes could not sustain resistance. The result was catastrophic. The population that had numbered in the tens of millions fell to roughly 325 wild individuals by 1884. In the autumn of 1864, the territory of Colorado was a place of accumulated grievance and fear. A gold rush in the late 1850s had brought thousands of miners and settlers pressing into lands that the Cheyenne and Arapaho still claimed under the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty. Raids on stagecoach lines, wagon trains, and frontier farms had frightened settlers and pushed many back toward fortified towns. The Civil War consumed the attention of the federal government, leaving the frontier largely to its own tensions. Colorado's governor, John Evans, organized a volunteer militia, the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, and appointed as its commander Colonel John Chivington, a former Methodist minister who had earned a reputation as a tough Union officer during the Civil War. The militia's posture was aggressive from the outset, shaped by political pressure to secure the region for settlement. Among the Cheyenne, there were leaders who sought peace. Chief Black Kettle was one of the most prominent among them, a senior leader, a member of the Council of 44 Chiefs, who had spent years pursuing accommodation with the United States. In the summer of 1864, he attended a peace conference at Camp Weld, and following the guidance he received, led his band and a group of Arapaho to the vicinity of Fort Lyon, believing they were under United States protection. They camped near Big Sandy Creek, a place that would be remembered afterward as Sand Creek. In the pre-dawn hours of November 29th, 1864, Chivington's force of roughly 675 volunteer soldiers descended on the sleeping village. Black Kettle raised a United States flag above his teepee. It made no difference. The soldiers attacked. An estimated 150 to 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho were killed, most of them women, children, and elders. Wounded survivors were executed. The village was set alight. What had been presented as a military engagement was, in the clear light of afterward, a massacre. The news of what had happened at Sand Creek traveled quickly. In Denver, Chivington's soldiers were welcomed with cheers. But in the wider nation, the reaction was one of outrage. Newspapers described what had unfolded as a national disgrace, a betrayal of promises, an assault on people who had come in peace. Congressional committees and a military commission launched investigations in 1865. The reports were damning. The massacre was publicly condemned, and yet no one was prosecuted. Chivington resigned his commission and escaped the reach of military justice entirely. Black Kettle survived the attack. He had not taken part in any retaliation. In the months and years that followed, he continued to pursue the only path he had ever believed in: diplomacy. He signed the Little Arkansas Treaty of 1865 and the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867. each time hoping that an agreement might bring his people safety. His faith in peaceful resolution did not waver even after the horror of Sand Creek. 4 years later, on the morning of November 27th, 1868, soldiers of the 7th Cavalry attacked Black Kettle's village on the Washita River. He and his wife attempted to flee across the freezing water. They were shot and killed in the river. Elsewhere, other forms of resistance were taking shape. In the Powder River country of Wyoming and Montana, the Lakota war chief Red Cloud was organizing a coalition of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho to resist the United States Army's attempts to build forts along the Bozeman Trail. The trail cut through lands the Lakota considered their own hunting grounds. The forts were a provocation that Red Cloud would not allow to stand. The war that followed, Red Cloud's War, from 1866 to 1868, would end in something almost without precedent: a military and diplomatic victory for the Native coalition. Red Cloud's War brought the United States to the negotiating table on terms the Native coalition had set. Through sustained military pressure, including the annihilation of an entire cavalry detachment of around 80 men in the Fetterman Massacre of 1866, and effective engagements in the Hayfield and Wagon Box battles of 1867, the Lakota coalition made the Bozeman Trail forts costly and untenable. The army withdrew. The 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie was the result. The Bozeman Trail was permanently closed, the forts were abandoned, and the Great Sioux Reservation, including the sacred Black Hills, was guaranteed to the Lakota for their absolute and undisturbed use. For roughly 8 years, that guarantee held. Then, in 1874, an expedition led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer entered the Black Hills and confirmed what prospectors had long suspected. There was gold. Custer had graduated near the bottom of his West Point class in 1861, risen rapidly through the ranks during the Civil War as a bold and flamboyant cavalry commander, and after the war remained in the regular army. He held a hostile, expansionist view of the native nations, seeing them as obstacles to be removed from the path of American settlement. Now his expedition had opened a door that the 1868 treaty had been meant to keep shut. The gold rush that followed was immediate and unstoppable. Prospectors flooded into the Black Hills regardless of treaty provisions. The federal government, rather than enforcing its own agreement, demanded that the Lakota relinquish the hills. When tribal leaders refused, the army was authorized to compel the non-reservation Sioux to relocate by force. The deadline set was early 1876. It was ignored. And so began the Great Sioux War, the war that would produce the most famous battle in the history of the American frontier. The summer of 1876 gathered the great leaders of the Lakota, the Northern Cheyenne, and the Arapaho into one of the largest concentrations of native fighting strength the plains had ever seen. Along the Little Bighorn River in what is now southeastern Montana, a vast encampment stretched across the valley. Thousands of people, thousands of horses, the lodges of many bands gathered together by the gravity of the moment and by the visions of one man above all others. Sitting Bull, Dathanka Iotake, was a Hunkpapa Lakota holy man and chief whose authority flowed from both spiritual and military sources. In the days before the battle, he had performed the sun dance, fasting and bearing the marks of sacrifice, and from his suffering had come a vision. soldiers falling from the sky into the camp like grasshoppers, a sign of victory. The vision spread through the encampment and steadied its resolve. The military mind of the resistance was Crazy Horse, the Shunke Witko, an Oglala Lakota war leader whose genius for battle lay in his intimate knowledge of terrain, his ability to mobilize and coordinate thousands of warriors across dispersed bands, and his mastery of surprise and encirclement. He led from the front, personally always, yet maintained a humility and spiritual focus that set him apart from simpler accounts of battlefield valor. On June 25, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel Custer divided his 7th Cavalry into 3 separate groups and moved against the encampment. He had miscalculated both the size of the force arrayed against him and the nature of what was about to happen. While Major Reno's column was driven back to the high bluffs and held there, Custer pressed forward with roughly 210 men. They were surrounded on a ridge. Not one of them survived. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was the most decisive native victory of the frontier wars, and it sealed the fate of those who had won it. The news of Little Bighorn reached the eastern states and struck like a thunderclap. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. Within months, a vastly reinforced military campaign poured onto the northern plains, pursuing the Lakota through winter campaigns and relentless pressure. One by one, the bands were worn down, their food supplies destroyed, their camps repeatedly scattered. By 1877, most of the leaders had surrendered or fled. Crazy Horse surrendered with his band at the Red Cloud Agency in May of 1877. He was transferred to Fort Robinson in Nebraska. There, in September of the same year, he was killed, bayoneted during a struggle while being taken to the guardhouse, dying of his wounds before the night was out. Sitting Bull led his people north into Canada, living in exile for several years. But when the bison vanished from the Canadian plains as well, starvation followed. He returned to the United States in 1881, was arrested, and eventually confined at Standing Rock. Elsewhere, other resistances were drawing toward their ends. In the Pacific Northwest, Chief Joseph of the Wallowa Nez Perce led his people on one of the most remarkable fighting retreats in military history, 1,170 miles across Oregon, Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana, engaging and eluding United States Army forces commanded by generals such as Oliver Howard and Nelson Miles. In October 1877, just 40 miles from the Canadian border, he surrendered at Bear Paw Mountain with the 418 Nez Perce who remained, many of them women and children. His words at that surrender have never been forgotten. "I am tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. The old men are all dead. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." They were the words of a man who had sought not conquest, but simply the right to remain, and who had been denied even that. With the last of the great military resistances broken, the United States turned to the quieter, but no less devastating work of dismantling what remained of native sovereignty on the reservations. The Dawes Act of 1887, championed by Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts and signed by President Grover Cleveland, was presented as a reform, a means of bringing native peoples into the mainstream of American life. It authorized the subdivision of tribal communal lands into individual parcels, assigned to heads of families. Surplus lands Whatever was left after allotment were opened to non-native settlement. The results were catastrophic. Native-held acreage fell from roughly 138 million acres in 1887 to about 48 million acres by 1934, a loss of some 90 million acres. Tribal governments were weakened. Families were left landless and impoverished. The communal bonds that had sustained nations for generations were deliberately frayed. On the reservations themselves, life in the 1880s and 1890s was marked by chronic food insecurity. Government rations were inadequate, lacking protein, fresh produce, and sufficient calories. Malnutrition was widespread. Disease, tuberculosis, trachoma moved through the communities with terrible efficiency. Traditional ceremonies were banned. The sun dance was outlawed. Medicine men were arrested. Cultural practices were driven underground. And then the children were taken. Indian boarding schools, government and church-run institutions removed children from their families, often sending them far from home. Their hair was cut. Their names were changed. Their languages were forbidden. Their religions were replaced with Christianity. At schools such as the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, the explicit goal was, in the words of its founder, to kill the Indian in order to save the man. The trauma of these schools rippled through generations and has not ended. Yet even within this darkness, the nations held on. Languages were kept alive in whispers. Ceremonies continued in secret. Treaties were cited in courts. Communities endured. In the final years of the 1880s, out of the desperation and grief of the reservation era, a new hope arose among the Plains nations. Not a military hope this time, but a spiritual one. A northern Paiute shaman named Wovoka, also known as Jack Wilson, experienced a vision and began teaching a new ceremonial practice, the ghost dance. By performing this round dance, the living would be reunited with the spirits of the dead. The buffalo would return, the settlers would recede. A restored world of traditional life and spiritual harmony would come again. The movement spread rapidly among the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and others. Special shirts were made, ghost shirts, believed to turn away bullets. For peoples who had lost almost everything, the ghost dance carried both spiritual hope and a quiet political defiance, a collective refusal to accept that the old world was truly gone. The United States authorities did not see a prayer. They saw a threat. Additional army troops were sent to the Lakota reservations. Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Cheyenne River, and Standing Rock were occupied. Indian Inspector James McLaughlin ordered the arrest of Sitting Bull, believing him to be encouraging the movement. On December 15th, 1890, during the attempted arrest at Standing Rock, Sitting Bull was killed by Indian Agency police in the confrontation that followed. 2 weeks later, on December 29th, 1890, the 7th Cavalry surrounded a band of Miniconjou Lakota, led by Chief Bigfoot near Wounded Knee Creek on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Soldiers attempted to disarm the camp. A shot was fired, by which side no one can say with certainty. The soldiers opened fire. Between 150 and 300 Lakota were killed, many of them women and children. The cavalry suffered 25 dead. The massacre at Wounded Knee was the last great act of the frontier wars. That same year, the United States Census Bureau declared the frontier closed. Even as the last battles were being fought and the last resistances were being broken, a parallel process was already underway in which the messy, violent, and morally tangled reality of the frontier was being alchemized into something cleaner, brighter, and entirely more comfortable. And the legends of the Wild West were being born almost before the West itself had ended. Chapter 6: Outlaws, Lawmen, Homesteaders, and the Birth of the Wild West Legend. Across the vast, open stretch of the American West, a particular kind of town rose and fell with the suddenness of a summer storm. These were the boomtowns, places conjured almost overnight from bare earth and ambition, drawn into existence by the discovery of gold or silver buried beneath the hills, or by the convergence of cattle trails and railroad lines that crossed the prairie like stitches in old cloth. When wealth announced itself beneath the ground, word spread quickly, and the people followed. Prospectors, laborers, gamblers, merchants, and speculators arrived in numbers that far outpaced any reasonable preparation for their coming. Housing was makeshift, water scarce, sanitation nearly absent. Law enforcement, where it existed at all, was thin and frequently overwhelmed. The population surged and the social order strained under the weight of so many newcomers, each one eager for fortune and unwilling to wait for the slower rhythms of civilization to catch up. Tombstone and Deadwood rose on the promise of mineral wealth. Abilene and Dodge City flourished at the crossroads of cattle drives and rail lines. Each of these places shared a common anatomy. Saloons and gambling halls occupied the most prominent corners. Cemeteries filled quietly at the edges of town, and the law moved through it all with uncertain authority. Their fortunes were as volatile as the forces that created them. When mines closed or cattle routes shifted, the energy drained away as quickly as it had arrived. What remained was something harder to quantify than gold or beef: a reputation, a story, a name that would linger long after the last lamp was extinguished on the last crowded street. Among the many figures the frontier produced, few have drifted further from their actual lives into the realm of legend than the young man known as Billy the Kid. His birth name was Henry McCarty, born somewhere around 1859, most likely in New York City. By the time the West had finished with him, he was 21 years old, and already the subject of stories that bore little resemblance to the facts of his short life. His mother died when he was still a boy. Orphaned by 15, arrested for petty theft at 16, he moved through the New Mexico territory with the restless uncertainty of someone who had never been given a stable place to stand. He drifted toward cattle rustling and robbery, and then into something larger and more dangerous. The Lincoln County War drew him in. Between 1878 and 1881, Lincoln County, New Mexico, became the battleground for a fierce rivalry between two economic factions: the entrenched Murphy-Dolan monopoly, which controlled much of the county's commerce and law enforcement, and a rival group led by English rancher John Tunstall, his partner Alexander McSween, and cattle baron John Chisholm. When Tunstall was murdered by a posse aligned with the Murphy-Dolan side, his supporters formed a loose vigilante group called the Regulators. Billy the Kid joined them, participating in killings and skirmishes that would define how the world came to see him. He adopted the alias William H. Bonney. He was linked to 9 killings, though historians believe he was directly responsible for 4. He was eventually pursued by Sheriff Pat Garrett, who shot him at Fort Sumner on July 14th, 1881. The legend, however, was far from finished. If Billy the Kid was the creature of the Southwest, Jesse Woodson James belonged entirely to Missouri, to the torn and complicated world that the Civil War had left behind. Born in 1847 in the Little Dixie region of the state, he grew up in a household shaped by strong Southern sympathies and a Baptist faith that sat quietly alongside the violence that would come to define his name. When Union soldiers raided his family farm in 1863, the teenage Jesse and his older brother Frank joined the Confederate guerrillas. They rode first with William Quantrill's raiders, and later with the brutal band known as Bloody Bill Anderson, participating in actions whose ferocity would mark the James brothers long after the war ended. The Centralia Massacre and the Lawrence Raid were among the episodes that shadowed their early years. When peace came in 1865, it brought little comfort to men who had spent their formative years in irregular warfare. The James brothers turned their experience and their network of former bushwhackers toward criminal enterprise. They robbed banks, stagecoaches, and trains. From the Liberty, Missouri bank robbery onward through at least 12 bank holdups, 5 train robberies, and 5 stagecoach raids, the James Younger gang built one of the most feared and widely publicized outlaw operations of the post-Civil War era, operating across a dozen states and amassing tens of thousands of dollars in stolen money. They were not quiet about it. Jesse, in particular, cultivated his public image carefully, writing letters to newspaper editors claiming innocence and framing his crimes as a form of resistance against Northern Reconstruction policies. The papers, both friendly and hostile, helped construct a legend that no trial could have built so thoroughly. Jesse James did not die the way legends prefer their heroes to die. There was no confrontation on a dusty street, no final standoff with a badge-wearing adversary. On April 3, 1882, inside his home in St. Joseph, Missouri, a fellow gang member named Robert Ford shot him in the back while he was adjusting a picture on the wall. Ford had been offered $10,000 by the governor for James's capture. The killing was immediate and unglamorous, and yet the story that grew from it was neither immediate nor unglamorous. Jesse James had already been lionized by newspapers and dime novels during his own lifetime. The pro-Confederate press had long portrayed him as a defender of Southern honor, a man pushed into outlawry by the cruelties of Reconstruction. His death at the hands of a treacherous associate, a man who had shared his table and his trust, struck many as a final confirmation of the injustice the world had dealt him. The martyrdom narrative took hold quickly. James had been shot by a coward, the stories said, for money, from behind. The Robin Hood image that had already begun forming around him hardened into something more permanent. Newspapers that had once reported his crimes with lurid enthusiasm now printed sympathetic eulogies. Dime novels amplified the myth further, and a folk hero was cemented in the American imagination with a velocity that no amount of historical correction has ever fully managed to slow. The actual record tells a different story. Jesse James was a violent man who committed violent acts and died because someone chose profit over loyalty. But that story, plain and factual as it is, has always sat quietly beside the larger, louder one. In the silver mining town of Tombstone, Arizona Territory, the tensions of the American frontier gathered themselves into a single, concentrated moment on the afternoon of October 26, 1881. What happened in the vacant lot near the OK Corral that day lasted less than 30 seconds. The story has never stopped being told. The confrontation was not simply a disagreement between lawmen and outlaws. It was the visible surface of a much deeper conflict. On one side stood Deputy U.S. Marshal Virgil Earp, his brothers Wyatt and Morgan, and their associate, the gambler and dentist, Doc Holliday. They were aligned with Tombstone's Republican business community, mine owners, newspaper editors, and northern investors who wanted order imposed and the town's firearms ordinance enforced. Opposed to them were the cowboys, Ike and Billy Clanton, Frank and Tom McClory, and others loosely connected to the Democratic-aligned cattlemen and rustlers of the region. They were supported by Cochise County Sheriff Johnny Bayon, a political rival of the Earps who belonged to a different vision of how the frontier ought to be governed. The immediate cause of the gunfight was the Earps' attempt to disarm the cowboys under the town ordinance. What followed left 3 cowboys dead: Billy Clanton, Tom McClory, and Frank McClory, and 3 lawmen wounded. Ike Clanton filed murder charges. A month-long preliminary hearing followed. The presiding judge dismissed the case, finding the Earps had acted in self-defense. The legal outcome settled nothing in human terms. Virgil Earp was later ambushed and maimed. Morgan Earp was murdered. Wyatt, unwilling to wait for the law, pursued a vendetta through the desert winter that would follow him the rest of his long life. Wyatt Earp was 47 years old when the 20th century began, and he would live until 1929, long enough to become a living artifact, a man who had walked through the history that others were already mythologizing. But his reputation as the iconic frontier lawman had been assembled over decades and across several towns before Tombstone ever entered his life. Born in Illinois in 1848 and raised in a family that moved repeatedly across the frontier, Earp had worked as a stagecoach driver, freight hauler, and real estate speculator before finding his most reliable employment on the rough side of law enforcement. He served as a deputy city marshal in Wichita and Dodge City, where he earned a reputation as a hard, effective street officer, willing to use the butt of his revolver as readily as the authority of his badge. Alongside him in Tombstone, and for years before that, was John Henry Holliday, Doc Holliday, a man whose story sits at an angle to almost every expectation. Born in Georgia in 1851, Holliday graduated from the Philadelphia Dental College and was diagnosed with tuberculosis in 1872. He moved west for the dry air, abandoned dentistry, and settled into the life of a professional gambler. He met Wyatt Earp on the Texas gambling circuit in 1878, and the friendship that followed was genuine and loyal in ways the frontier rarely produced. Historians believe Holliday killed between 1 and 3 men during his lifetime, far fewer than the dozens the legend assigns him. He died not in a gunfight, but of tuberculosis in Colorado in 1887, at the age of 36, thin and quiet at the end, far from the noise of the stories being told about him. The frontier was not populated only by the men whose names filled newspapers and dime novels. Alongside the outlaws and lawmen moved a quieter and more varied humanity. And among the most significant figures of that world was Bass Reeves, a man whose story the dominant mythology of the Wild West almost entirely forgot to tell. Born into slavery in July 1838, Reeves escaped during the Civil War and eventually made his way to the Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma. He became fluent in several Native American languages, learned the landscape with the intimate knowledge of a man who had needed to disappear into it, and developed a reputation as a skilled tracker and a man of notable physical courage. In the years that followed, Bass Reeves became one of the first black deputy U.S. Marshals west of the Mississippi River. He patrolled roughly 75,000 square miles of the Indian Territory, made more than 3,000 arrests over the course of a career spanning more than 3 decades, and killed 20 outlaws in the line of duty. He operated under the authority of the federal court at Fort Smith, Arkansas, and his record of service was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. His story was not the story the popular imagination chose to preserve. The Western myth preferred its heroes to conform to a particular image, and Reeves did not fit the template being constructed in the dime novels and the traveling shows. But the historical record is clear and unhurried in its testimony. Bass Reeves brought law to a region of the country where law was fragile, and he did so with a consistency and effectiveness that few of his more celebrated contemporaries could honestly claim to match. While the names of outlaws and lawmen echoed through newspapers and saloon talk, another kind of life was being built in patient silence across the Great Plains. The Homestead Act of 1862 had opened an enormous door. Any adult citizen or declared immigrant who was at least 21 years old could claim a quarter section of surveyed public land, 160 acres, for a nominal filing fee. In exchange, they were required to live on the land, build a dwelling, and cultivate the soil for 5 continuous years before receiving a federal patent. Approximately 2 million claims were eventually filed. Around 1.6 million were successfully completed. Roughly 10% of those claimants were women filing as heads of household, a fact that the mythology of the frontier, with its preference for mounted men and drawn guns, seldom remembered to include. The people who answered the Homestead Act's invitation were not a single community. Scandinavian settlers, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, and Finnish families clustered across North and South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas, building their sod houses and establishing churches and mutual aid societies. German-speaking immigrants, including Mennonite communities who had previously lived in Russia, formed tightly knit colonies centered on shared faith and agricultural knowledge. Black homesteaders, moving in what became known as the Exoduster movement, fled the hostility of the post-Reconstruction South and established settlements in Kansas, including the historic community of Nicodemus. Each group arrived carrying different languages and different memories, and each contributed to the slow, difficult project of building something permanent from the prairie's unyielding soil. The land they settled was beautiful in its way. It was also profoundly difficult, The life the homesteaders built was not the life the stories would later describe. The frontier of popular imagination was a place of dramatic action, of quick movement through open country. The frontier of actual experience was slower, harder, and far more intimate with failure. Drought arrived without warning and stayed for years, killing crops and drying wells. Locust swarms descended in darkening clouds that blocked the light and devoured everything the earth had managed to produce. Prairie fires swept across the grasslands with a speed that left little time for more than grief. Blizzards buried homesteads under heavy snow in winters that seemed to have no intention of ending. Isolation was its own particular weight. Settlers lived miles from the nearest neighbor, far from doctors, far from markets, far from the sound of other voices. Women who filed claims as heads of household managed these conditions alone, performing the full range of physical labor that farm life demanded: planting, harvesting, building, repairing, preserving food, caring for livestock, and raising children, while also maintaining the social networks that kept communities from dissolving entirely into silence. Most homesteaders arrived with very little capital. Equipment had to be borrowed or bought on credit. Railroad companies charged high freight rates that consumed profits before they could be saved. Single-crop farming left families vulnerable to the unpredictable rhythms of both weather and market. Many could not sustain the 5 years required to receive their patent. They walked away from claims that had taken everything they had, leaving behind the small, careful marks of their presence: a well, a fence post, a depression in the earth where a sod house once stood, slowly absorbed back into the prairie that had always been indifferent to their ambitions. By 1893, the United States Census had declared that the frontier, defined as a line of settlement moving steadily westward, no longer existed. The open country had been claimed, organized, and catalogued. A young historian named Frederick Jackson Turner chose that moment to deliver a paper to the American Historical Association in Chicago that would shape the way the nation understood itself for generations. Turner argued that the existence of the frontier had been the decisive force in shaping American democracy. The availability of free, unsettled land, he said, had compelled settlers to develop self-reliance, individualism, and democratic institutions, breaking free from the hierarchical traditions of Europe and producing a distinct national character built on liberty and innovation. His thesis was elegant, and it arrived at exactly the moment the country needed a story about itself. It was also, subsequent historians would argue, deeply incomplete. The new Western history, which gathered momentum through the late 20th century in the work of scholars such as Patricia Limerick, Richard Wyatt, and Donald Worster, recast the frontier not as a triumph, but as a zone of conquest, dispossession, and environmental transformation. Turner's narrative, they pointed out, virtually erased the experiences of Native Americans, African Americans, women, and other marginalized groups. It treated the frontier as empty land waiting to be made meaningful, ignoring the peoples who already lived there and the violence through which that land was taken. Buffalo Bill Cody had already been performing his own version of this story for a decade. His Wild West show, launched in 1883, offered audiences a spectacular, dramatized rendering of the frontier: cowboys, Native American performers, shooting exhibitions, and reenacted bison hunts that turned history into spectacle and spectacle into belief. What the Wild West myth chose to remember was never a simple accident of forgetfulness. It was a selection made carefully and repeatedly across decades of novels, newspapers, traveling shows, and eventually film. Edwin S. Porter's 1903 film The Great Train Robbery translated the mythos of the frontier into moving images for the first time in a complete and narrative form, creating the template that would generate an entire genre. The lone hero, the outlaw gang, the stagecoach holdups, the dusty town saloon. These conventions, refined throughout the silent era and elevated to cultural prominence during Hollywood's golden age between 1940 and 1960, became the architecture of an American identity story told to itself and to the world. What the myth preserved was a romantic image of rugged individualism, clean moral confrontations, and a frontier conquered by personal virtue. What it omitted was the strict gun control ordinances that governed many of those famous towns, the diverse and complicated social fabric that included women, minorities, and laborers whose contributions the legend did not find useful. The massive role of railroads and corporations in shaping Western development, and the dispossession and violence through which native peoples lost their lands and their futures. Belle Starr, Calamity Jane, Bass Reeves, the Exodusters, the Scandinavian and German homesteaders, the women who filed their own land claims and built their own farms. These lives existed. They were part of the same history. They simply did not conform to the story that was being assembled from selected pieces of the past. And so the frontier closes not with a final gunshot or a last sunset ride, but with something quieter and more permanent. The slow realization that the story we chose to tell about this land and these people would outlast every fact, and that the legend, for better and for worse, had become as real as the history it replaced.